Hello and welcome to episode 20 of the Monday Night Review. I seem to now just be recording from my bed because this is the never-ending cold. I've seemed to have gone from one kind of weird virus to another, and I just feel kind of rubbish. So I've been going to bed really early, but I have got a new microphone, which hopefully will mean better sound quality, but also that you can't hear the snoring of my dog, who is sitting by my feet right now. There was nearly no episode today. I've just been feeling really rough. I had to go somewhere with my husband today. We managed to get petrol, and I have been in bed since about 5, and I thought, I'm just not going to be able to do it today. And then I got so involved in the topic we're going to talk about that I thought, why the hell not? So, episode 20. I was about to say double figures, but we've been in double figures for a while. But still, it's always nice to get to a round 10 number, isn't it? And this one, actually, shout out to my husband, because I hadn't heard of this, didn't know it existed. As always, I'm slightly frustrated, as you'll see why, because I want to finish it. But today, we're going to talk about a secret part of London that I didn't know existed. I'm always amazed at how many bits of London there are that I just had no idea about. And if I'd known about this before I had a billion and one things to do involving school pickup and drop off and children and work, I'd be going right there to see it now. So we're going to talk about Postman's Park. Postman's Park is a public garden in central London. It's close to St Paul's Cathedral, and it's one of the largest open spaces in the City of London. We've talked about this before. The City of London doesn't refer to the City of London as a whole. It refers to the sort of central business area of London in a very specific bit, which is by St Paul's Cathedral. And it opened in 1880, and it's on the site of a former churchyard and burial ground of St Botolph's Aldersgate Church. And it's expanded over the next 20 years to incorporate the adjacent burial grounds of Christ Church, Greyfriars and St Leonard Foster Lane, together with the site of housing that's been demolished in the area. And the ownership of this location has become a huge, lengthy dispute between the church, the post office, the treasury, and it's all weird. There was a shortage of space for burials in London, and so corpses were often laid on the ground and covered over with soil. And so the park is kind of raised above the streets that surround it. As interesting as that is, that's not what we're here to talk about. The bit we want to talk about is the George Frederic Watts Memorial to the Heroic Self-Sacrifice, a memorial to ordinary people who died while saving the lives of others who might otherwise be forgotten. So this is a lodger with long wall on one side of the park, and there are memorial tablets along the wall. Watts was a painter and sculptor, and he came up with this idea as part of a way to commemorate the Golden Jubilee of Queen Victoria. And his idea was originally rejected, but then he was approached by Henry Gamble, who's the vicar of St Botolph's of Aldersgate, and who thought it would be a good way to raise the profile of the park that stood on the church's former graveyard and generally be a sort of good thing for the area. The plan was to have 120 memorial tablets along this wall. Watts had people in mind for these tablets, and he was working with someone to make the tablets. Only 4 of the planned 120 memorial tablets were in place at the time of the memorial opening in 1900, and 9 more tablets were added during Watts's lifetime. So he dies in 1904. And his wife, Mary Watts, takes over the management of the project, and she oversees the installation of a further 35 memorial tablets over the following 4 years, and she adds a little monument to Watts at the same time. But then the original designer of the tiles quits to become a novelist. Why not? And the only people who can sort of take over the work are Royal Dalton, and she is really dissatisfied with the way they do the tablets, and she kind of just loses interest. I think it's one of those things where perhaps it was her husband's passion and it doesn't really do a lot for her, and it's not making her any money, and it's causing more trouble than it's worth. She loses interest, and work on it stops in 1931 with only 53 of the 120 planned tiles in place. And in 2009, the first new tablet in 78 years was added. And I really hope they continue, but that was still 11 years ago, so it's not looking good, is it? So we're not going to go through all the tablets, but we will look at some of them more in depth. At least 18 of the tiles are dedicated to those who drowned whilst trying to save others. 9 are dedicated to women, 9 to children, 53 are men, with at least 14 tiles referring to fire, 4 incidents involving a train, 2 died. 2 of the tiles are dedicated to those who died saving others from attempts at suicide. Most of the women mentioned died saving others from fires. Sarah Smith died of terrible injuries received whilst attempting in her inflammable dress to extinguish the flames which had enveloped her companion. Ooh, some of them sound really grim. So the first tile to go up commemorated Thomas Griffin, a fitters labourer who died on April the 12th, 1899 in a boiler explosion at Battersea Sugar Refinery. He was fatally scalded in returning to search for his mate. An excruciating way to go, and no word on whether his mate survived. I think it was unlikely. The first woman mentioned is Mary Rogers, who died on the 30th of March 1899 when she drowned on the SS Stella as it sunk. So Mary had a far from easy life. She was born and she lived in Southampton, one of 6 children. Her husband, Richard, who worked for the London and South Western Railway as a seaman, had drowned in 1880, 4 years into their marriage. She was left 6 months pregnant and with a toddler to look after. And at the time, you didn't get offered any kind of compensation. The company would offer for the spouse or the eldest child to have a job with them. So obviously she's got a toddler. She's the one that's being offered the job. So almost as soon as she gives birth to her second son in January 1881, she goes off to be a stewardess for the LSWR company. So initially she has terrible seasickness, but then it turns out that she's actually fantastic at this job. And it's meant that her family is saved from the workhouse. It's really difficult for women at the time, especially single women with children, to get work. Her parents were able to look after her 2 children. And she was able to do this well-paid job that she got tips from passengers, and she was great at it. So as a stewardess, she's responsible for the health and well-being of the women and children on board. Obviously, at this time, there was still a sort of great divide between men and women. So you needed stewardesses that would be able to help nurse any women and children that had seasickness or other illnesses, would be able to tend to them in their cabins. If they needed anything taking to them, they would obviously be able to go into the cabin and all of that. In October 1819, the Stella was completed and provided a popular service from Mary's home in Southampton to Guernsey and Jersey. In 1899, Mary had become a senior stewardess, and on the 30th of March, the Stella left Southampton with 174 passengers and 43 crew on board. They started off in fine weather, but they were 10 minutes late, so the captain goes full speed. And at 3 o'clock that afternoon, a fog descends, but the captain refuses to reduce his speed, and he kind of miscalculates where the ship's position is and turns the boat at just the wrong moment. And at 4 p.m, it strikes a familiar rock called Black Rock, just 8 miles west of Alderney, and the engines are torn from their mountings and water just pours in. It takes only 8 minutes for the boat to disappear beneath the surface. Though there are life jackets for 754 people, the lifeboats could only carry 148. And at the speed at which this is all happening, there's a real haphazard deployment of the boats. 2 of the boats just go under with the original ship. They can't even get them loose. And Mary witnesses this. She witnesses one of the boats being overloaded and capsizing. And later on, after about 24 hours, they managed to right the boat, and some of the survivors managed to climb in. But Mary just sees this boat capsizing and realises that she will be the person to capsize the boat that she's offered a place in. She realises that she's a person too many. So she refuses her place in the boat, and there's a report in the Jersey Times on the 15th of April 1899 which says, Mrs. Rogers, with great presence of mind and calmness, got all the ladies from her cabin to the side of the ship, and after placing life belts on as many as were without them, she assisted them into the small boats. Then turning around, she saw yet another young lady without a belt, whereupon she insisted on placing her own belt upon her and led her to the fast-filling boat. The sailors called out, "Jump in, Mrs. Rogers, jump in," the water being then but a few inches from the top of the boat. "No, no," she replied, "if I get in, I will sink the boat. Goodbye, goodbye." And then with uplifted hand she said, "Lord save me," and immediately the ship sank beneath her feet. Of the 217 passengers and crew on the Stella that day, 112 survived and 105 drowned or died from exposure. It's not the only mention of the LSWR. Daniel Pemberton later on has a tile dedicated to him, and he was working with his mate, and they were surprised by a train when gauging the line on the train track, and he hurled his mate out of the way, saving his life, and gets hit by the train himself. Another tile is dedicated to Frederic Mills, A. Rutter, Robert Durant, and F.D. Jones. Feel like they should get a mention for most disgustingly heroic deaths, as they lost their lives bravely striving to save a comrade at the sewage pumping works in East Ham. There are now going to be mentions of children, which is distressing. John Clinton, aged 10, is the first child mentioned, and he dies trying to save a younger child from drowning. 12-year-old David Sells is said to have supported his drowning playfellow and sank with him clasped in his arms. Henry James Bristow saved his little sister's life by tearing off her flaming clothes, but caught fire himself and died of burns and shock. 9-year-old William Fisher tried to save his brother from being run over and was himself killed. There's no word on whether his brother was saved, and a similar tale is told of Solomon Gallman, who, aged 11, saved his brother from being run over on Commercial Street, but was himself hit. Thomas Simpson dies of exhaustion after saving many lives from breaking ice at Highgate Ponds. Elizabeth Coghlan died saving her family and house by carrying blazing paraffin into the yard. Arthur Strange and Mark Tomlinson died trying to save 2 girls from quicksand in Lincolnshire and were themselves engulfed. And then we have a couple of doctors as well. Mr. William Freer Lucas is the second mentioned, but he's first in my story. He has a child with diphtheria brought into the hospital who needs a life-saving tracheotomy. Chloroform's needed to be administered, and during the inhalation some mucus is coughed out onto Lucas's face. He just holds firm onto the inhaler to make sure that the child is fully sedated before he wipes away the mucus. He contracts the deadly disease and died himself. Dr. Samuel Rabbath is a doctor at the Royal Free Hospital, and he dies in similar circumstances when treating a 4-year-old diphtheria patient. An obstruction blocks the tube, and the doctors are unable to clear it, and Rabbath puts his own lips to the tracheotomy tube, sucks out the obstruction, and contracts the disease, and both he and the child die. One of the tiles is dedicated to Alice Ayres, who becomes a sort of main plot point for the 2004 film Closer, and she was one of the key figures mentioned by Watts when he first discusses plans for the memorial, though she's not one of the first tiles. She died saving 3 children from a burning building. And then we got the most recent to be put up, which was put up in June 2009 and is dedicated to 30-year-old Lee Pitt, who in 2007 saved a drowning boy from the canal in Thamesmead. He hears the cries of the child who's fallen in from his flat, and he runs out, takes off his shoes and his trousers and jumps in himself, and he holds the child above his head whilst onlookers get a hose to pull the child out with. The sides of the canal are 15 feet high and covered in slippery moss, so Pitt has no way of getting out himself, and once the child is pulled to safety, he just disappears under the water. The police arrive and there's no life-saving equipment anywhere near, so a PC who sees Pitt unconscious in the water jumps in to save him, but he himself can't get out either. Pitt's unconscious. They have to wait for fire brigade to bring them a rope, and he's pronounced dead as soon as he reaches the hospital. Only 53 of the 120 spaces have been filled, and the Watts Gallery are reluctant to complete it, saying it's a symbol of the Watts' values and beliefs to leave it as it is. I think that's a load of old bollocks. I think if you say you're going to do 120, do 120. I don't think Watts will have chosen to die. I think his wife lost interest. I do see that carrying on something that your husband started is a bit of a ball ache. But honestly, I think it's such a lovely memorial, and it's such an incredibly interesting part of London that it would be so nice to carry on filling up the 120 spaces. And I know it's really difficult to choose when so many people die so selflessly all the time, but I think it should be carried on. And that is the Postman's Park George Frederic Watts Memorial to Heroic Self-Sacrifice, which I hadn't heard of, and I'm not sure, maybe you guys won't have either. One of those London places that none of us Londoners ever know. I hope you enjoyed. This is a real quickie episode from my sickbed. Please keep your fingers crossed that next week I'm feeling a little bit more human. As always, you can contact us at The Monday Night Revue on Facebook and Instagram, and you can email themondaynightrevue@gmail.com. And until next week, be kind, stay safe, and always check the back seat before you drive.